Hello and welcome. My name is Hauskeller. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Exeter in the UK, where I lead a research group on philosophy and psychedelics. I studied in Frankfurt philosophy, sociology, and psychoanalysis in the 1980s and 90s, and completed my PhD with a study on theories of the subject in modernity, especially on Michel Foucault and Judith Butler. Since then, I've worked in philosophy of medicine, and that includes the epistemologies, ontologies, ethics, politics, and emerging bioeconomies of contemporary biomedicine. And this perspective will shine through this talk. Under the now enriched title, From the Shadows into the Neon Light, I focus on what medicalization does to extraordinary experiences. I argue that the psychiatric power grab on psychedelics may restrict or even destroy what makes these experiences life-changing for people in non-clinical settings. I begin with a characterization of alienation as part of the Western human condition, especially in Western Enlightenment capitalism. I then introduce the concept of medicalization and explore the role and methods of psychiatry, especially diagnosis, and how the use of psychedelics is framed and scientificized. I conclude that so-called psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is a paradoxical project, a discipline that proceeds with scientific methods and concepts, endorses the irrational, or more strongly, the science that both makes and treats madness, induces states of madness to overcome madness. Psychiatry must endorse experiences that it usually calls mad, or it must take the irrational of exceptional experiences out of them to make them fit with the scientific paradigms of psychiatry. I call this the psychedelic-psychiatric paradox. The topics I will address in the course of this talk are alienation, medicalization, psychiatric diagnosis, individualization, the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, as it is called, set and setting of the clinical arena, and finally, the psychedelic-psychiatric paradox, in which psychiatry is likely to bury irrational and non-individualizing dimensions of exceptional experiences. According to the Frankfurt School theorists, especially Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse, alienation is the existential condition of the human in the enlightened secular capitalist society. They draw on the social account of alienation, which was initially developed by Marx to describe the effects of capitalism on society and on human beings. There are three traits of Western enlightenment that are particularly important for creating the state of alienation. They are rationalization, and that here means the oppression of the irrational. Then individualization, and that is the denial of the interconnectedness of humans with others and with nature. And see the monetization and appropriation of everything. For Marx, alienation arises from the separation of the products of one's own labor and the exploitation that is entailed in this very alienation of one's labor. With the Enlightenment, the disposition to celebrate detachments from and domination over nature becomes the ultima ratio of the age. Instrumental rationality and valorizing everything are the legitimized motivations for human action. People invest into a friendship or calculate the benefits of caring for family members. Anything else would seem naive and irrational. If you don't calculate to gain, you will be exploited. The resulting stage of being is alienation, feeling alienated from oneself, from others, from nature, and from what goes on in the wider world. Alienation leads to a repressed and distorted condition of body and mind. Detachment from nature is an important element in the modern casserole of ideologies and social structures, but so is the ideology of liberal individualism that denies the need for human community and connection. The basic principle in the capitalist order is that the value of an action, a behavior, or a person can be measured in terms of their contribution to society, and especially to gross domestic product. Weakness on body or mind reduce one's competitiveness in the struggle for success and recognition. These conditions can be non-idiopathic reasons for causing what we might see as symptoms of alienation: anger, anxiety, sadness, loneliness, and desperation. In such a social order, existential connections to other humans, animals, and nature, including one's own nature, are severed. This general state of alienation is, however, the perfect condition for consumer capitalism. The lone and vulnerable individual can be directed to buy, to fetishize surrogate gratifications. Many goods, activities, or events promise to temporarily fill the void. Consumer capitalism thrives on the emotional exploitation of individuals, and they are sold anything: bread and games, things and events, drugs, surgeries, and psychotherapy. Whilst we succumb to the system of exploitation and oppression, we are still aware, though, that something is wrong. Most individuals have at least a nagging sense that, on the whole, this is vain and that things should be different. Yet, in the solitary confinement of alienation, we each know that we are powerless to change the conditions we live under. Subcultures of resistance have emerged throughout the 20th century. One of them is the counterculture of the 1960s, when psychedelics became fashionable. Young people especially wanted to escape the rat race and the moral oppression of the post-war period. Trips were a means to experience a self not bounded by the rationalist individualizing order. In 1969, Frankfurt School theorist Herbert Marcuse wrote that an established society imposes upon all its members the same medium of perception. The trip involves the dissolution of the ego shaped by the established society, an artificial and short-lived dissolution. But the artificial and private liberation anticipates, in a distorted manner, an exigency of the social liberation. The revolution must be at the same time a revolution in perception, which will accompany the material and intellectual reconstruction of society, creating the new aesthetic environment. Awareness of the need for such a revolution in perception, for a new sensorium, is perhaps the kernel of truth in the psychedelic search. Marcuse is careful here when he says that the extraordinary experiences may indeed serve to make people understand that it is society and its basic rules of play that are alienating people and making them sick. Fundamental change of the system is needed to remedy the harm, but no way to achieve such revolutionary change is apparent. In the 1970s, the simultaneous psychological instrumentalization of psychedelics in the interest of political control may serve to illustrate that it is naive to believe that consuming psychedelics alone would be a cure. The CIA conducted now infamous experiments to make new people using psychedelics and other drugs. This shows that nothing is protected from the claws of institutions in their fight for power, and also that psychedelic substances in themselves are not remedies. Together, the counterculture's widely reported success in creating ways of life outside the big machine, and the scandalous failure of the unethical and brutal psychological mind control projects provided the grounds for the demonization of psychedelics. Another reason for the prohibition that is more in keeping with the need of structural oppression may be the nature of the profound experiences, often considered religious, that people report from psychedelic trips. Experiences that change a person's values and generate enthusiasm for non-conformist living, threaten a societal order that is built on enforced conformity. Psychedelics were couched as drugs that distort and make promising young people go mad, so much so that these people reject their obligations to society and to bourgeois morality. Psychedelics were listed and prohibited as Class A drugs, and with that, mostly off limits for psychological research until the early 21st century. Now, exceptional experiences are rediscovered, reborn in medical scientific psychiatry. The state of the art of trials currently underway, or trials reporting on psychedelics in the psychiatric clinic, has been summarized in Franklin King's talk, which I defer to for details. Together with the dollar amounts invested into such research and development worldwide, the amount of work underway shows that the establishment takeover of psychedelics is well underway. It takes the form of medicalization. Medicalization is a concept advanced by figures such as Peter Conrad. The meaning is comprehensively expressed in the title of his book, The Medicalization of Society, on the transformation of human conditions into treatable disorders. Medicalization names a function creep in medicine. This refers to the empirical phenomenon that ever more common human conditions, physical, mental, or developmental, are brought under the auspices of medicine as an institution. More and more of what is human is also becoming a subject of medicine and diagnosis, viewed through the medical gaze, as Foucault called it. Body and mind, feeling and behavior are classified as either healthy or unhealthy. How we look, act, feel is a matter for physicians. Medicalization entails two dimensions. One is that drugs, in our case psychedelic substances, will have to become drug products. There is a whole bioeconomy and regulatory regime in place that governs and ensures the transformation of natural plants or indigenous practices into marketable products for which Western industries can obtain intellectual property. The second dimension of the medicalization of psychedelics concerns the exceptional experience itself. Can a discipline that has the job of distinguishing between the rational and reasonable on the one side, and on the other the irrational, crazy or mad, can such a discipline really do justice and include the fullness of a psychedelic trip into its toolbox of standard treatments for major diseases? Psychiatry's strategic use of extraordinary personal experiences as a novel tool in the catalogue of treatments widens the remit and concerns of medicine. I will explore what happens to exceptional experiences and the process of their medicalization in psychiatry. The incorporation of psychedelic substances into the arsenal of psychiatric tools is a major expansion of the medical industrial complex in its reinterpretation of human conditions. The unusual aspect is the kind of human cognitive and embodied experience that is adopted into scientific medicine. Psychedelic trips show many features of experiences that under all other circumstances, psychiatrists identify as signs of madness. The psychiatric adoption of psychedelics aims at, on the one hand, taking control of individual exceptional experiences by transforming them into a tamed element within psychiatry, and taking control of the mind-altering substances by transforming them into mass-produced standardized chemicals within the arsenal of prescription drugs. There would be much to say about the latter point, but it is not the topic here. I focus on the relationship between states of mind and exceptional experiences when they are filtered through the psychiatric apparatus. And the first aspect of this is diagnosis. Under the medical regime, access to psychedelic experiences requires the diagnosis of a major mental illness. Diagnosis is a technique of social stratification. Michel Foucault identified educational methods of disciplining people as the dominant mode of subjection in modernity, and he includes in this disciplining body and mind to make people more efficiently work within the hierarchical orders of power. Conforming to the images of normality becomes important because deviation is punished with loss of social standing, loss of legal and personal freedom, even exclusion and incarceration in an asylum. Mental illness is a label attached to specific behavioral deviations. The epistemology, ontologies, and assessment criteria in psychiatry are geared towards normalizing patients so that they can cope better. They are not designed to ready them, the patients, for living a fulfilling life on their own terms, outside the big machine that needs its cogs. As Hubert Dreyfus wrote in the foreword to Michel Foucault's Mental Illness and Psychology, the ultimate form of alienation in our society is not repression and exclusion of the truth, but rather the constitution of the individual subject as the locus of pathology. All forms of psychotherapy can at best provide only isolated and temporary cures. As manifestations of our everyday cultural practices, all psychotherapies solve individual problems without combating our general malaise. Psychiatry has made it its business to individualize and rationalize what I call the symptoms of alienation. This process of rationalization and individualization is deeply ingrained in both psychiatric diagnosis and treatment techniques. The reasons for patient suffering are seen as lying within the patient. They may be inherited, genetic, biological causes. They may be psychological and the effects of deficits in love and care, education and discipline. These would teach any child how to cope with the everyday demands of a society or with loss and trauma. There is, to put it in other words, a kind of Münchhausen expectation in play. A human who is formed properly by biology and society should be able to pull themselves on their own hair out of swamps of unhealthy, unnormal feeling and thinking. The aim of most psychiatric treatment is to enable the patient to act as if they were autonomous, fully functioning individuals competing in the markets of life, but largely untroubled about what goes on in the wider world. To help them along so that they can fit in. But the treatment repertoire for many severe conditions is poor and often brutal. Substances that can affect mental reorganization in several troubled or at-risk patients could help three parties. First, these struggling patients. Second, the field of psychiatry by increasing its standing and success rates. And finally, the industries that make the drugs. Now psychedelics, plant-derived or synthetically produced, are reinvented as tools of psychiatry, psychology, and end-of-life care. How exactly is this going? What is actually happening there? To get a taste how medicalization works, I will just do look at a very minimal example. And that is related to the framing of the whole enterprise. How do the clinicians describe their project and what happens in them? The trialed treatments are commonly named psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. In this expression, the psychedelic is subordinate to the overall clinical setting. The main treatment is a defined number of counseling sessions. To increase its efficacy, the talk and cure uses a little helper. This helper delivers for the patient a couple of extraordinary cognitive and embodied experiences that are an integrated part of the therapy. Yet, when we listen to Franklin King's talk and read the reports of clinical trial findings, it appears the opposite happens. Psychotherapy alone has long been assessed as often ineffectual and very costly, especially for the conditions that trial psychedelics now. The added psychedelic experience makes the big difference. It seems to change patients' attitudes to the world, to life, and to themselves. And the measurable symptoms of major depression or anxiety decrease markedly and over the longer term. Even long-nurtured addictions lose their hold and patients can let them go. What seems to happen to patients in the clinical trials is that the thinly controlled variable, namely what the patient experiences during their trips, is what improves their state of mind and being. If the improvement is due to the psychedelic experience and not the counseling, then it would be more accurate to call this clinical endeavor counselor-assisted, substance-induced exceptional experiences. This new name pays due credit. it makes it apparent that the need for and specific professional qualifications of the counselor may be exchangeable. Not so the psychedelic. It matters where we place the weight in our descriptions, whether the psychedelic experience is the addendum or the cure. The clinical trial reports describe the counseling sessions as the safe setting that ensures the patient is prepared for and can integrate their extraordinary experiences on psychedelics. The safeguarding function of the counseling is underlined by the mock privacy of the treatment rooms. They are arranged to look like hotel rooms or private psychoanalysis spaces, with a couch, nice pillows, dimmed lighting, and music. The whole clinical arrangement is geared towards enabling repeat extraordinary experiences. They are the actual treatment, and they happen in the private mind of the patient. In comparison to other clinical trials, these seem quite uncontrolled. The psychiatrist can check the patient's state of mind before and after. They can standardize and adjust the drug and the dose for length and intensity of the trip according to the patient's body weight, for example. But the main event, namely what happens for and to the patient on their trip, is and will remain beyond the control of the psychiatrist. So all the psychiatric space does is allow who can go on trips and what people experience, and that people experience them safely. Set and setting are about the state of mind and the relationship in context. What is needed is a guidance which requires experience and knowledge. What kind and amount of psychedelic experiences make a counselor qualified for this role? Other safekeeping and integration practices have been practiced for millennia. The clinical trials draw on established knowledges about the effects of extraordinary experiences on the mind and well-being. They are modified reenactments of known practices, molded where possible to fit the parameters of a clinical trial. Nothing suggests the patient would not have benefited as much from the experience under non-medical expert guidance. Of course, that is only true if that were fully legal or decriminalized at least. So to make the safekeeping claims of the clinical trials even weaker, Tizim Noorani reports meeting former patients from psychedelic clinical trials and support groups where they seek more exchange and support for integrating the experiences they had on psychedelics within the clinical trials. Such anecdotal evidence raises doubts about the quality of the safekeeping and the ability of the clinical environment to give psychedelic extraordinary experiences the time and space needed to work through them. So let's ask, is the separation of the psychiatric treatment from the patient's everyday life and social community a disadvantage compared to non-clinical guided use? Arguably, being part of a culture or community that is experienced with psychedelics is a much safer and more reliable setting than a professionalized counseling room in which the hours of talking and the trips are numbered. The paradox of rationalizing the power of an irrational, non-individualistic experience. The science of mental illness, its methods of diagnosis and treatment, is built on distinguishing reason from madness. Its epistemology excludes the features of the trip that psychedelic users say contribute to the mental reset, change their outlook and attitude. Scientific psychiatry must endorse the irrational with rational methods, and it can only measure the effect. The language and the concepts of scientific psychiatry are organized to judge, create hierarchies, and distinguish the health and reasonable from the crazy. It does not have the language or the concepts to explain what happens or to support the patient fully. They have to find their own ways of integrating self-transcending, mystical or fantastical experiences that cannot be part of the psychiatric conversation. Which language will the patient use to describe when talking about the experience in order to integrate it? The jargon of psychiatry does not allow for speaking about visions, mystic experiences, etc., without describing yourself as mad at the same time. This means that the exceptional experience itself might be affected by the setting. What can be said might without sounding like a lunatic. Or are tripped experiences somehow radically different from dreams on the one hand, and other experiences of having visions or hearing voices and sounds that are not there? The science that both makes and treats madness and uses states of madness to overcome madness. If you put it like that, it sounds mad, but instead it is about power and money. This paradox can be solved in several ways. One is that psychiatry can openly endorse the irrational as not the other, but as part of itself. That would lead to radical change to the basic epistemology of individualization and repair through reason or sedation. Psychiatry fundamentally would have to turn itself into something very different from the science it is now. The alternative way of resolving the paradox, or one of them, would be that psychiatry rationalizes the irrational so that it becomes an acceptable part of psychiatry itself. So in that case, the profound alterity of exceptional experiences will be dosed and rationalized to size. Because psychiatry is part of a commercial medical industrial complex, and because it works in conjunction with the other institutional powers, other disciplining institutions, Enlightenment rationality, the capitalist forces of big pharma, and its own survival as a power player in society, the latter is bound to happen, the rationalization of psychedelics. What does this mean? Psychiatry's rules of making sense are likely to be upheld. The patient is individualized in the process of diagnosis, and the mental disorder is their personal illness alone. They need to want help, and that help is scientifically tested and paid for. It is overseen by a paid-for psychologist. But what those rules are mobilized to enable is an experience that transcends the rules of this game and the underlying image of what the normal human mind is like. Prohibitive drug laws make medicine the obvious institution to go soft on psychedelics. There's a mutual enabling alliance of criminal law and exemptions ring-fenced for the medical sector and its partners in pharma. Psychiatry is the only possible habitat for a legally controlled and socially conformist reintroduction of exceptional experiences on prescription. From a critical theory perspective, the features that make this habitat suitable make it problematic. Because the psychiatric science space requires individuals to surrender to clinical regimes of control and to gain access to exceptional experiences. The psychiatric space also limits access and use to patients for healing purposes. It does not provide access for self-directed experiments in living, for fun or thrill, or for personal self-care. Psychiatry and psychology are major players in the social and power order that causes alienation via normalization and standardization. Medicine, studying patients as objects, often in very paternalistic mindsets, is no agent against alienating social structures. The mystical, the magical, and irrational fears have no place in the space between a vulnerable diagnosed patient and the curious, rational, judging psychiatric counselor. I worry that the current trials with microdosing are designed to prevent major changes and retain clients. They allow a bit of exceptional experience, but keep the person within the system so that they can fully participate in all the available forms of alienating self-exploitation. A therapeutic that works effectively and for a prolonged period of time, or even for life, is not in the interest of psychiatrists or of the pharmaceutical industry. The more often clients demand the treatment, the more money can be extracted, and the more power lies in the hands of the industry. Microdosing might be a technique to comfort without radical change, and thus creating cravings for more, that is, mental attachment or addiction to the psychiatric psychedelic treatment. Psychedelic experiences may thus become twistless, operationalized for the big machine. The Renaissance in psychiatry is, similar to its namesake many hundred years ago, a new form of colonization. Colonized are experiences and knowledge that counteract radical individualization. In that process, those experiences themselves are likely to be colonized, privatized, and commercialized. They have to be adapted to fit the clinical parameters of rationalized language that can clearly separate the sensible from the crazy, the fantastic from the real, and what is part of one person and what is not. The nature of psychedelic exceptional experiences is anathema to the scientific rationality that psychiatry is trying to use. One of the special psychedelic experiences is the expansion of self, feeling one, a unity of oneself with others and the non-human environment and the universe. It is the counter-alien experience. Filtering this experience through the monetized medicalization machine exposes and subordinates it to be dismantled by powers so alien to it. Once the medical industrial complex has taken control of the narrative, knowledges that are now part of their daily life and culture may be losing legitimacy. Indigenous, traditional, and lay knowledges and practices are likely to be reframed as dubious, irrational, and unproven. One circumstance inviting this domination and exploitation of traditional knowledges is the exceptional status of medicine in society. It controls who and what is healthy or not, and it controls the means to help. Medics decide over social status and freedom, life and death, pain and delirium. So to sum up, amongst these colonizations of exceptional experiences, through medicalization, we'll find that another human experience becomes an object of medical science and is likely to be commodified to for-profit treatments. In the process, patients will be made. People who are melancholic for maybe very sensible reasons, because it, to me, appears quite sensible and an adequate response to the state of the world if one feels sad, angry, depressed, or powerless at the scale of things that are going wrong. But in order to gain access to psychedelics under the new regime, these feelings have to be turned into diseases, and with that, patients stigmatized as not being normal, because only not normal people will get access to the treatments. Then the treatment itself, the psychedelic and the effect it has on the human mind and body, will be controlled wherever possible. And I think that microdosing is one of the techniques that might be used for actually not setting patients free, if that makes any sense, but to actually control the experience and secure long-term custom. Behind this whole development is a global political bioeconomy of what I call the medical industrial complex. And there's a lot to say about this, and we can do this next time. But this is a highly problematic structure in which psychedelics that can reduce alienation will instead be seeing a psychiatric takeover. That is what I would call a hostile takeover, because I suspect that all other forms of using psychedelics and having exceptional experiences on substance will be delegitimized in the process of establishing such treatments under the big umbrella of medical care. This entails also an epistemicide of indigenous, traditional, and non-clinical knowledges. There is a theft of these techniques, but without recognizing the theft, the originators of that knowledge are likely to be marginalized and excluded from the emerging new clinical, pharmaceutical, and proven treatments that psychiatrists are developing now. I'm really interested in these last questions, and I will study them much more. We have one little project in Exeter now with Amelia Fiske, Ernesto Schwarz-Marin, Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, and myself, looking at ways of decolonizing the philosophy and anthropology of psychedelics. But I finish here now. I thank you for listening and for your attention.